And good morning, everybody, and welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here on the program. We have a lot to cover, including a live trial that we're about to jump to, so let's get started right now. First up, I want to let all of our viewers know that we are dark today in the Jeremiah Monell case out of New Jersey. No live court feed there. Again, he's charged with the murder of his wife, Tara O'Shea Watson, by allegedly stabbing her to death. We believe that trial will continue tomorrow. A little bit later on in the program, at around 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we are going to continue our coverage of the Charles Merritt case out of California. This is better known as the McStay family murder case, a brutal crime, a brutal discovery. We are going to continue our coverage out of California at 12:30 p.m. Right now, though, we are live in the retrial of Melanie Eam, this young woman who's on trial for allegedly stabbing her then-boyfriend, James Barry Jr., to death. He was only 21 years old, and the prosecution says that she did this because he broke up with her. Right now, the defense's opening statement is currently underway. Let's go live. Okay, this is the retrial of Melanie Eam. A lot to talk about already. I want to bring in forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, this is the retrial of this woman. Her first trial ended in a mistrial. The jurors couldn't decide whether or not this was second-degree murder, or some actually wanted to go for manslaughter. But what the defense is doing, same thing they did last time, saying that it wasn't Melanie Eam who committed this crime, but it was really Guy Hand, the victim's mother's boyfriend. I'm curious your thoughts about what we learned in that opening statement.
Well, I thought that the defense put forward a pretty interesting argument there. One drop of blood on this shirt we're talking about, and they stated that this gentleman was stabbed 7 times. This is what's up with us covering, these multiple stab wound cases. There seem to be a plethora of them.
Fortunately, that's the reality.
Yeah, no kidding. This would have been a horrible scene, just blood everywhere. So it's going to be very difficult. It's kind of difficult to get around this idea that there would not be more transfer than that. He talked about blood spatter, which I'm very interested to see. He talked about it being on the ceiling, on the walls, this sort of thing. That's referred to as cast off. Just imagine, I like to teach my students at Jacksonville State this one principle, that if you don't understand blood spatter and cast off, just think about dipping the tip of a paintbrush in a paint can and just slinging it over the top of your head. And that's kind of what you have going on here. This guy is in a defenseless position. Whoever's doing this to him is atop him and just driving this knife into him multiple times, not just one time, but multiple times. Does she have the strength to facilitate this? What was his status at that particular time prior to? So all of this is going to come into play. And I actually thought that just hearing this snippet of what the defense has to offer is quite compelling.
Yeah, I agree with you. This is, right at the beginning, the jury last time didn't believe the defense's argument one way or another. Maybe it'll be different this time around, but this is just the beginning. We're going to come back. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll have the first witness. You're just joining us at the beginning of the Melanie Eam trial. We'll be right back. Okay, first witness in the Melanie Eam retrial, back here with Joseph Scott Morgan. This really feels that it's about the crime scene, right? I mean, this is not a case about did Melanie Eam do this and why did she do it? They're saying, was she even the person who did it? So, Joseph, is there any indication from what we're learning a little bit about the crime scene that puts a question mark on whether she did this or Guy Hand, remember, the boyfriend of the victim's mother, who did this?
I think that it's in this context, it's kind of premature to speculate on that. However, when you do have this middle-aged male, as he described him, as the officer described him from the stand, standing there distraught in the room, I'm assuming that he's probably got blood all over him at this point in time. That's it kind of refocuses where you're going to go. With this investigation. Remember, this guy is first eyes on at the scene. And that's why his testimony is so critical, because what he does is literally transporting us back in time and giving us his worldview of what he saw and observed at that moment in time when they first rolled up there.
Yeah, Joseph, you always say it tells such a story, that crime scene, and that's the story that we're trying to figure out what really happened to James Barry Jr. I'll tell you what, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll be live in that courtroom, and maybe we'll get some more answers. We'll be right back. Joseph, interesting witness there talking about what aid was rendered to the victim when they arrived at the scene. What did you make of it?
I found it curious that that defense didn't probe this guy a little bit to at least they want to talk about this, what's standard. This guy's a content area expert in CPR. You know, if they're going forward with this idea he didn't do the right thing, referring to this other gentleman that was at the scene, why wouldn't you probe him a little bit further to kind of establish that? This guy's probably taught classes for the Red Cross potentially, or for the county, and he could address this thoroughly. So that was kind of interesting. Also, you know, defense prosecution is just trying to paint the picture here relative to the scenario and the timeline, what had happened. But kind of shocked that defense didn't kind of probe this guy a little bit more.
Yeah, a little interesting moment. Of course, you're talking about Guy Hand. This is the person the defense is saying ultimately killed James Barry Jr. This was the boyfriend of his mother who was there that night. We have a new witness on the stand. Let's go live.
And I think that's about it.
Okay, Joseph, we have a new witness on the stand. Just looking at some of his credentials, do you make anything the viewer should be aware of?
Well, many times viewers are shocked. Many people are shocked when they learn that some crime scene investigators are, in fact, not police officers. They're not sworn, as is referred to many times. That means they haven't gone through the police academy. They're not detectives. They're not going to go out and question individuals. They work at the direction of the detectives that are managing the scene itself. These guys are not there. This gentleman on the stand is not there to interpret evidence. He is there to collect, or to document and collect and secure that evidence. So it's kind of a shock to many people when they hear this. It's variable from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Sometimes police officers work their entire career just to attain the position that this guy is in, and sometimes you're hired directly in as a civilian.
Well, real life is not like the movies. We all learn something here on Law and Crime, including me. I didn't even know that. So let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be live in the courtroom. Stay tuned.
Yes, there were blood drops on the floor.
As we go through the crime scene, Joseph, I want to just go back to what the defense argued. They're saying that it was Guy Hand, the boyfriend of the victim's mother, who did this, that one of the things, he's a former butcher, he picked up the knife, carried it to the kitchen, then washed one of his hands. And when you look at Melanie Eam's sweater, she didn't have a ton of blood on it, but he had a ton of blood on his hands. I'm curious what you make about these arguments.
Well, if he was engaged, it begins with me. If he's engaged in actually attempting to render aid to this guy, he's going to have a copious amount of blood all over him. I find it interesting that she would only have this one spot, as previously identified, on the shirt or the clothing. If you know, they stated that she, you know, surrendered this clothing upon her admission. So yeah, it is kind of curious. Keep in mind, and it's very simple science. If you've got multiple holes in an area that contain a liquid like blood, and you're compressing them, you're going to have blood going everywhere.
Yeah.
The trick is trying to separate that from him actually being the alleged perpetrator.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the idea that he went and brought the knife to the kitchen, or allegedly did this and washed his hands, that's a question that I have. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll be live in the courtroom. Stay tuned. Joseph, how many times do we say that the crime scene tells a story here, but also the victim tells a story as well? What struck me was the defensive wounds. Did you catch that? I'm curious what you make of that, the fact that there were defensive wounds found on the body.
Well, with defensive wounds, one of the things that first pops to mind is that the victim has an awareness they are being attacked. Okay, that's a reactive response. Your hand goes up in order to block. The arm will go up in order to block. So there is a conscious awareness that has to exist. So what that tells us is that the individual is not incapacitated prior to them being stabbed. Okay, and also it goes to what we refer to as positionality. That is the relationship between the victim and the assailant that is attacking them. And so this gentleman is literally talking about how he had to demonstrate that at the scene photographically. For every photograph that we see, that is a moment that is literally captured in time that we cannot go back to. That's why this, for many people that watch this, they think that this is very tedious. It's not. It is an absolute necessity for us to be able to paint the picture in a court of law, and that's why they go over all of this stuff over and over and over again.
Yeah, and it's all necessary. And as you said, yes, James Berry Jr., the victim, he knew what happened to him, and unfortunately he succumbed to those wounds. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll be live in the courtroom. Okay, so this gives us a good opportunity to talk about the knife. Joseph, you had mentioned something to me which was really interesting. This knife, this apparent murder weapon, isn't like anything else, is it?
No, it's not. If you take a look at it, this is a butchering knife. It's got kind of a scimitar-shaped blade on it, curved, this sort of thing. And if you notice that it's a good representation here, that's a white plastic handle. This is a professional kitchen knife. This is not something that you just run out to a big box store and pick up necessarily. This is something, this is obviously the brand on it is Dexter, that the forging on that knife is particularly resilient. And why this is important to me as a forensics guy is the fact that in order to bend the tip of that knife, it would take a tremendous amount of pressure in order to facilitate that kind of this downward pressure where you're striking bone, perhaps, and the tip actually bent. Well, keep in mind, not to be too graphic, these knives are made for butchering. So they're meant to stand the test of if we're going to, say, for instance, cut steak or butcher a large animal, say a side of beef or something in the kitchen setting, they're meant to be resilient, Jesse. So the fact that it is bent gives us an indication that a tremendous amount of force was applied to this knife. And so we have to measure that. Now, we
know that Guy Hand, the one that the defense is saying ultimately did this, is a butcher, but more importantly, you talk about the pressure. Melanie Eam, was a young girl. Could she have exerted that force in the same way that someone like Guy Hand could have?
Yeah, it would depend. Just the depictions that I've seen of her, she's rather of slight build. I don't know that she could necessarily generate that kind of force that's necessary in order to facilitate the bending of the tip of this knife. And we would have to see. And another important question is this. Was the tip of the knife bent prior to? Okay? Mm-hmm. So we can't just assume that they went in and that if this knife was, in fact, the instrument that was used, that it wasn't already faulty. I think that someone might bring that up as well. But if I were the defense, I would begin to look at the tensile strength of this blade and how many pounds of pressure it takes to kind of render this thing in this particular attitude.
My first thought is, what are you bending a knife cutting steak here? No, it's meant to do that. So I'm wondering if it's more bent because of this attack. I'll tell you what, though, Joseph, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to jump live in that courtroom, and clearly we are learning a lot about what happened to James Berry Jr. We'll be right back. If you're just joining us, this is a live feed into the Melanie Eam retrial. You might remember that we covered her first trial here on Law and Crime. It was a mistrial. The jury was split between second-degree murder and manslaughter. It wasn't a question of whether or not she did it. They all thought she did it. They just couldn't tell what degree of culpability they would find for her. I'm back here with Joseph Scott Morgan, and we're talking about the evidence that we're seeing today being collected. And one of the things that I can't help but think about is how the blood gets from one area to another, Joseph. I mean, we were talking a little bit before about how they looked at the patio and there were even droplets of blood on the floor. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how blood is transferred in this kind of case? I mean, we have a man who was stabbed multiple times and ran throughout the house.
And what you're going to have, it's blood spatter is very dynamic, you can have, let's say, for instance, someone is attacked. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's break it down even simpler than that. Let's say anyone at home has ever had a bloody nose. You can either react by putting your hands up to your nose, getting a tissue, or you can run around in a panic. And each time that droplet hits a surface, a contacting surface, it's going to have a dynamic that is dictated by the surface that it strikes and the velocity at which it strikes and the angle of deflection, how it comes in. So if someone is saturated in blood and they're running around, you're going to have these passive drops that are all over the place. Maybe they put their hands on the walls. Maybe they've bent over to catch their breath. Or maybe the perpetrator's dropping blood all over the place. So it's a very dynamic environment.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, you know, we're talking about really deep wounds here, both, it seems, in the chest, maybe even the neck. And we talked about there were defensive wounds, too. It's not entirely clear from the testimony. I mean, I couldn't get it where those defensive wounds were. I think it might be the hands. But if anybody's just joining us, does that mean that James Berry Jr. knew who attacked him? That he was the one, he knows who attacked him, and he tried, or did he, you know, I mean, it could have been a chaotic scene.
Yeah, this kid had a reactive response, you know, to block at that point in time, and that's what's going on. I think any of us would react in the same way. And what that tells me, again, I have to go back to this idea, he had some kind of conscious awareness. That is, he's not incapacitated. He hadn't been struck in the head. Maybe you can say, well, did he have drugs on board? Was he passed out when this happened? I don't know, because we'll have to see what the toxicological standards are testing said about him. But he had an awareness he was being attacked, Jesse, and that's important here. And that needs to be made. Those details need to be made clear to the jury that this young man knew that he was being attacked. He had a full awareness of it because he made an effort to defend himself.
Now, what do you think the defense is going to do differently here? Because clearly last time they couldn't convince one juror that, you know, she didn't do it. They believed that she did it. They just didn't understand how she did this or in what manner she did this or what was her intent behind it. So they're still pointing the finger at Guy Hand. What do you think they need to do differently this time around?
I don't know. I think that they just need to put the full court press on here, and just drive forward with this narrative about Guy Hand. I think one of the places they could start with is that knife. He's skilled at the utilization of butchering knives. I'd want to explore this bent tip on the knife. I'd want to know about these issues, the dynamics of this environment. I'd bring in my own blood spatter expert to talk about what their perception is as to what happened and how can they interpret this. I'd want to talk about what the activities of the police were at the scene to document the scene, and did they do it thoroughly enough? It appears that they did, but I want to really press hard on these issues relative to the narrative that prosecution is putting up.
Yeah, and listen, the game, we all know the game here by the defense, to raise reasonable doubt. And I think what we talked about earlier, you made it so clear that the way this knife, the force that had to be used, this is not something that can just be ignored. And if you look at the size discrepancy between Melanie Eam and perhaps Guy Hand, that might be a question to think about. This butcher knife, which is used for cutting thick pieces of steak here, the fact that it would be bent, you know, that's a lot of force, as you said, maybe raises a question as to who used this. Now, I'm being told that there is a 5-minute break going on, so I think what we should do is take a quick break on our end, and when we come back, either we'll be live in that courtroom, or we'll have a lot more to talk about. So stay tuned here on Law&Crime. right, welcome back, everybody. So we are live right now in the Melanie Eam retrial, and they're about to start up again. They took a 5-minute break, but it's okay. It gives me some time to talk to Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. Now, Joseph, I'm going to ask you a question that may be impossible for you to answer, but hey, why not?
Will be the first time.
The manner of death here, okay, really brutal killing. Does that give you an indication about who did this? Because let's think about the motive here. The prosecution's saying that Melanie Eam did this because James Barry Jr. broke up with her. Guy Hand, who was the boyfriend of James Barry's mother, why would he want to kill this young man? They apparently had no conflict in the past. So does this give you any indication about who may have done this?
Well, obviously passion is involved. We're talking about multiple, not just single, but multiple stab wounds. And for me, as a forensics guy, that's always an indication of passion. Not to mention the fact that sharp force injuries in cases of homicide are up close and personal. This isn't something that's done at a distance. It's not something that's done in some kind of weird vacuum. This is someone in your face, in your immediate bubble, and they are driving a sharp instrument into your body. That means they have purpose. They have anger. It takes power in order to do this. And so for me, that means that the individual that would be involved with this is within somebody's intimate circle. That's who I'm going to look at as an investigator from Jump Street.
You really explained it in quite detail, the graphic nature about committing that attack as opposed to any other form. That is really up close, personal, and very brutal. Let's go back live into the courtroom. The witness is back on the stand. Wow, this is getting pretty testy. Joseph, I know our time together is coming to a conclusion. Thanks so much for coming on, and I apologize we didn't get a chance, a final comment from you, but thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jesse. It's a pleasure to be with you guys.
Of course. We can't wait to have you back, and we'll talk more about this case. Listen, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to jump into this courtroom and analyze what the defense attorney is trying to get at here. So stay tuned here on Law and Crime.